November 29th, 1864. Southeastern Colorado Territory. The temperature had dropped well below freezing overnight, and the ground along Sand Creek was iron hard, and the sky above the plains was the particular shade of gray that precedes a sunrise that has not yet decided whether it intends to arrive. 700 armed men had ridden through the darkness to reach this place, guided by officers who knew exactly what they had come to do, and had given their soldiers every reason to believe that what they had come to do was not only permitted, but necessary. The village ahead was sleeping. The fires had burned low. Above the largest lodge in the encampment, 2 flags moved in the cold morning air, a white flag and an American flag presented personally by Abraham Lincoln to the Cheyenne chief who had planted it there as the most visible declaration of peaceful intention that the symbols of the era made available to him. Colonel John Chivington gave the order to attack. Captain Silas Soule ordered his company to hold their fire. That decision, made in seconds inside the noise and momentum and overwhelming pressure of 700 men in motion, would define everything that followed. It would produce testimony that congressional investigators called the most damning first-hand account they received. It would make Soule the most dangerous witness in the most consequential military investigation the Colorado Territory had ever convened. And it would get him killed on a Denver street 4 months later, 3 weeks after his wedding, at 26 years old, by a man who was never convicted of his murder. This is the story history placed at the margins of Sand Creek. It belongs at the center. Silas Soule did not arrive at that frozen creek bed as an ordinary man placed in an extraordinary situation. He arrived as a man whose entire life had been a preparation for exactly this kind of moment, a man who had been asked before, in different forms and different circumstances, the same fundamental question that Sand Creek was now asking him, and who had answered it the same way every time, regardless of what the answer cost. He was born in Maine in 1838 into a family for whom moral conviction was not a Sunday sentiment but a daily practice with legal consequences. His father was a committed abolitionist who moved the family to Kansas Territory in the mid-1850s, directly into the violent borderland where the question of slavery was being settled not in legislative chambers but in midnight raids and retaliatory killings along the Missouri line. Young Soule did not observe that conflict from a safe distance. He rode with the abolitionist networks moving escaped slaves northward through routes that the Fugitive Slave Act made federal crimes. He participated in the audacious and ultimately failed attempt to break John Brown out of a Virginia jail in the weeks following the Harper's Ferry raid. He was a teenager doing things that grown men with more to lose had declined to attempt. By the time the Civil War arrived and gave him a military commission, Soule had already answered the question of what he would do when authority pointed in one direction and conscience pointed in another. He had answered it repeatedly, at personal risk, without the institutional protection that military rank might eventually provide. He knew exactly who he was before the Army told him what rank he held. He served with distinction at the Battle of Glorieta Pass in 1862. Where Union forces shattered a Confederate attempt to push through New Mexico and seize the Western Territories. He earned his captaincy. He earned the respect of the men he commanded. He arrived in the Colorado Territory as an officer of demonstrated capability, whose record gave his superiors no particular reason to anticipate the problem his conscience was about to become. The Colorado Territory of 1864 was a place operating at the outer edge of its own fear. Cheyenne and Arapaho raiding parties had struck settlements through the summer with a frequency and a violence that had driven the civilian population into a state of sustained alarm that months of inconclusive military response had done nothing to relieve. Colonel John Chivington understood fear the way a politically ambitious man understands any powerful force available to him, as something to be directed rather than managed, something that could be converted, through decisive action, into the kind of popular support that territorial politics rewarded with advancement. Chivington was not a man of half measures. He was a former Methodist minister of enormous physical presence, well over 6 feet, broad through the chest, the kind of man whose entry into a room rearranged its atmosphere before he spoke a word. He had genuine military courage and had demonstrated it at Glorieta Pass alongside Soule. He also had the absolute certainty of a man who had spent years in a pulpit telling other people what God required of them, and that certainty had not been made more flexible by the military authority the war had added to it. He had decided what Sand Creek was going to accomplish, and he had decided it was going to accomplish it before winter closed the campaign season and before the political moment that a decisive strike would produce passed beyond his reach. Black Kettle's encampment on Sand Creek was where he pointed that decision. Black Kettle was the Southern Cheyenne chief who had pursued peace with a patience that nothing the United States government had done had succeeded in exhausting. He had traveled to Washington. He had sat across tables from federal officials and signed documents that reduced Cheyenne territory with each successive agreement. He had accepted each time less than the time before because he believed that acceptance was the path that led somewhere his people could survive. He was camped at Sand Creek in November of 1864 because the military commanders at Fort Lyon had directed him there, had told him in the specific language of official instruction that his village would be safe in that location, that the army knew where he was, that he was recognized as friendly. He believed them. He raised the American flag Lincoln had given him above his lodge as the visible proof of that belief, and he went to sleep on the night of November 28th in a camp that the United States government had designated as a place of safety. He woke to cannon fire. Soule was in the column that rode through the darkness to Sand Creek. He saw what the arriving light revealed: the lodges, the sleeping encampment, the flags above Black Kettle's dwelling catching the gray pre-dawn wind. He heard Chivington's order move through the command. He felt the entire weight of military momentum pressing forward around him. 700 men, artillery positioned, the irreversible machinery of a military operation that had been set in motion hours ago and was now arriving at its purpose. He looked at the flags. He ordered his company to stand down. In the noise and chaos of what Chivington unleashed on Sand Creek that morning, Soule held his men back. He did not fire. He did not permit his command to fire. He sat on his horse at Sand Creek and witnessed what was done to Black Kettle's people by the soldiers who did not follow his example, and he committed every detail of what he witnessed to a memory that he intended to use. What was done at Sand Creek on the morning of November 29th, 1864, the specific nature of it, the scale of it, the character of what Chivington's men did to the men and women and children of that encampment, entered the congressional record through the testimony of multiple witnesses and was described by the investigators who received that testimony in language that left nothing ambiguous about what they had concluded. They were men accustomed to the measured vocabulary of official findings, and they set that vocabulary aside. What they found at Sand Creek required a different register, and they found it. The testimony that drove those conclusions hardest, that gave the investigation its most specific and most unimpeachable account of what had occurred, came from Silas Soule. He began writing within days of the massacre, letters to his commanding officer, to fellow officers, to anyone whose position gave his account a channel through which it could reach the people who needed to receive it. He wrote with the precision of a man who understood that precision was the only thing standing between what he had witnessed and the revision that powerful men with strong motivations were already preparing to apply to it. He named what he had seen. He described it with a directness that no careful reading could soften into something more comfortable. He knew what those letters were going to cost him. He sent them anyway. He testified before the military commission. He appeared before the congressional investigators. He gave his account without revision, without the diplomatic softening that survival might have counseled, without any apparent consideration for what his accuracy was doing to the future of a man who had the connections and the motivation to respond to it. Chivington's supporters attacked Soule's character, his motives, his military record, his reliability as a witness. The record did not cooperate with those attacks. Soule's account stood. It stands still. On the night of April 23, 1865, 23 days after his wedding, 4 months after Sand Creek, while the investigations his testimony had fueled were still in active progress, Silas Soule responded to a disturbance on a Denver street and was shot at close range. He died within minutes. He was 26 years old. The man identified as his killer was a soldier from Chivington's command. He was arrested. He escaped from military custody. He was never recaptured. He was never prosecuted. The investigation into Soule's death closed without a conviction, with a speed and a completeness that the subsequent record has never been able to explain through coincidence alone. Chivington was never court-martialed. He had mustered out of the army before the investigations concluded, the timing precise enough to place him permanently beyond the jurisdiction of military justice. He spent the remaining decades of his life defending what he had ordered at Sand Creek in newspaper interviews and veterans gatherings, with the unchanged conviction of a man who had decided that what he had done was right and that no congressional finding was going to alter that conclusion. He died in 1894. He defended Sand Creek to the end. A street in Denver carries Silas Soule's name today. A marker acknowledges what he did and what it produced and what it cost him. The city that cheered Chivington's return in December of 1864 arrived, across the long passage of time that honest historical reckoning requires, at a different understanding of what had occurred on that frozen creek bed and of the men who had been present for it. What no marker can hold, what the dimensions of public commemoration cannot contain, is the specific weight of what one young captain chose in the gray pre-dawn light of a November morning, when everything around him was moving in one direction, and the flags above Black Kettle's lodge were visible in the growing light, and the order had been given, and 700 men were in motion. He saw what was about to happen. He had one moment to decide what kind of man he was going to be when it did. He already knew the answer. He had known it since Kansas, since John Brown's jail, since every night ride through Missouri border country with escaped slaves and federal warrants somewhere behind him in the dark. He ordered his men to stand down, and then he picked up a pen, and that, in the long accounting that history makes of such mornings, was the more consequential weapon of the two.